She should have recognized the signs. The way his compliments carried an edge that cut deeper than she wanted to admit. The way his touch sometimes felt like an apology. But hindsight is cruel like that. It sharpens the things we once softened, forcing us to see what we had spent so long ignoring. The first time she met Daniel, it felt like stepping into a dream she didn't know she had. It was at an art gallery downtown, one of those trendy places filled with abstract pieces that only the boldest would pretend to understand. She'd gone reluctantly, dragged along by her best friend Maya, who insisted she needed to get out more. "I swear you're going to thank me for this," Maya had said, grinning as she sipped on a glass of overpriced wine. "This is where people meet their future husbands." She had rolled her eyes at the time, brushing off the comment with a laugh. But then, there he was, Daniel. He stood near a massive canvas splashed with chaotic streaks of red and gold, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored jacket. His presence commanded attention, even in a room full of people trying too hard to be interesting. "Do you get it?" he asked her, catching her staring at the same painting. His voice was smooth, laced with amusement, as though he already knew she didn't. She blinked, caught off guard. "I think it's supposed to be emotional?" He laughed, a deep, resonant sound that made her stomach flip. "That's the polite way of saying you have no idea." She smiled despite herself. "Well, do you?" "Not a clue," he admitted, stepping closer. "But I like pretending I do. Makes me seem mysterious." That was how it started. A conversation over a painting neither of them understood, spilling into drinks at the gallery's bar, and then a late-night walk under the city's flickering streetlights. He was magnetic, the kind of man whose charm felt effortless. She found herself laughing at his jokes, leaning into his warmth as the night grew colder. "What's your story?" he asked at one point, stopping to look at her. The way his eyes lingered made her feel uncovered, as though he could see parts of her she hadn't meant to show. "Just a girl trying to figure things out," she said with a shrug, trying to play it cool. "Well, just a girl," he said, his lips curving into a smile. "I think you might be the most intriguing person I've met in a long time." It was a line, of course. She knew that even then, but it didn't matter. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt seen, special. And when he asked for her number at the end of the night, she gave it to him without hesitation. Their relationship unfolded like a whirlwind in the weeks that followed. He was everything she thought she wanted. Funny, ambitious, attentive in a way that made her heart ache with gratitude. He would show up with flowers just because, surprise her with tickets to shows she'd only mentioned in passing, and hold her close as though she were the most precious thing in his world. But even in those early days there were moments that didn't sit right. Little things he would say, small hesitations in his compliments that left a sour taste in her mouth. "You're so articulate," he said once after she'd told him about a promotion at work. "Not everyone can carry themselves the way you do." She had smiled at the time, brushing it off as a clumsy attempt at praise. But later, alone in her apartment, the words echoed in her mind, leaving her restless. Then there was the first time he introduced her to one of his friends, a coworker from his law firm. "This is Clara," he'd said, his arm draped casually over her shoulders. "She's amazing. Honestly, I think she's way too good for me." The friend had smiled politely, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of surprise that Clara couldn't quite place. It wasn't until later that she realized what it was. He hadn't expected Daniel to be with someone like her. "You're imagining things," Daniel said when she brought it up. "He's just awkward around new people. Don't overthink it." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love could transcend the unspoken barriers the world erected. And so she pushed the doubts down, burying them beneath the glow of his affection. The first few months with Daniel were intoxicating. He had a way of making the world feel lighter, as though all her worries could be swept away by the force of his charm. They spent weekends wandering through the city, discovering tucked-away cafes and hidden bookstores. He introduced her to his favorite cocktail bars and insisted on teaching her how to make the perfect martini. "You've never had a real martini until I've made you one," he said one evening, standing confidently in her tiny kitchen. She watched him with a mixture of amusement and admiration, wondering how someone could be so effortlessly self-assured. "Oh, so you're a bartender now?" she teased, leaning against the counter. "I'm a man of many talents," he replied with a grin, sliding the glass across the counter toward her. It was moments like these that made her feel like she had found something rare, something worth holding on to. But even as she fell deeper into the relationship, there were cracks she couldn't quite ignore. It was in the way he spoke about her, as though her identity was a quirk rather than a fundamental part of who she was. "You're not like other black women," he said once after she'd made a joke about his inability to keep up with her when they went jogging. She froze, the laughter dying in her throat. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. He shrugged, oblivious to the weight of his words. "You're just different, in a good way." The comment gnawed at her long after the conversation had moved on. She wanted to confront him, to make him understand how reductive and dismissive his words were, but she didn't. She told herself he hadn't meant any harm, that he couldn't possibly understand the weight of what he'd said. Her best friend, Maya, wasn't so forgiving. "You're seriously okay with this?" Maya asked one night as they sat in her apartment, a bottle of wine between them. "What are you talking about?" Clara replied, feigning ignorance. Maya gave her a look, the kind that saw right through her defenses. "You know what I'm talking about. The way he talks to you, the way he talks about you." Clara sighed, taking a long sip of her wine. "He doesn't mean anything by it. He's just clueless sometimes." "Clueless?" Maya's voice was sharp now, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Clara, he's not clueless. He's showing you who he is and you're ignoring it." Clara bristled, setting her glass down with more force than she intended. "You don't know him like I do. He cares about me, okay? He didn't grow up around people like me. He doesn't get it." "Exactly," Maya shot back. "And he's not trying to get it. You're bending over backward to excuse him, and for what? So he can keep treating you like some kind of exception to the rule?" Clara turned away, blinking back tears. She hated how easily Maya could cut through her defenses, how her words always seemed to hit too close to home. "He loves me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Maya. Maya sighed, her voice softening. "I just don't want to see you get hurt. You deserve someone who sees all of you, not just the parts that fit into his world." Deep down, Clara knew Maya was right, but love had a way of making her hold on tighter, even when her grip was slipping. As the weeks turned into months, the subtle slights and microaggressions began to pile up, each one a tiny crack in the foundation of their relationship. Like the time they were out shopping and a sales associate followed her through the store, her watchful gaze heavy with suspicion. "Relax," Daniel said when Clara whispered her discomfort to him. "She's just doing her job." Or the time they went to a wedding together, and one of his relatives made an offhand comment about how exotic she looked. Daniel had laughed it off, pulling Clara close and whispering, "Don't let it bother you. People don't mean any harm." But it did bother her. It bothered her that he didn't see the harm, that he brushed off the moments that left her feeling small and unseen. Still, she stayed. She stayed because she loved him, because she wanted to believe that love could overcome anything. She stayed because leaving felt like admitting that Maya had been right all along. Clara had spent the better part of the day preparing for the dinner party. It wasn't just any gathering. It was with Daniel's friends, people he'd known since college, a group he spoke of with reverence. These were the people who had shaped him, the ones whose approval mattered most to him. "They're good people," he'd assured her earlier that week, brushing a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "A little intense sometimes, but you'll love them. And they'll love you." Clara had smiled at that, though her stomach churned with nerves. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this night could be a chance to solidify her place not just in his life, but in the world he had built for himself. She chose her outfit carefully, a sleek black midi dress paired with gold earrings that caught the light just enough to make a statement. As she checked her reflection in the mirror, a flicker of doubt crept in. Would they see her as an equal? Or would they see her as an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong? Daniel had arrived to pick her up with his usual charm, planting a kiss on her cheek and telling her she looked stunning. "You're going to knock them dead," he said with a grin, and for a moment she let herself believe him. The dinner was held in a sprawling apartment overlooking the city, the kind of place Clara had only ever seen in magazines. The space was filled with warm light and the hum of conversation, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine. Daniel introduced her to everyone as they walked in, his arm draped casually over her back. "This is Clara," he said, his voice smooth and confident, "the woman who keeps me on my toes." The group was polite, their smiles wide but their eyes assessing. Clara felt their gazes linger a moment too long, as though they were trying to place her, to fit her into the neatly defined boxes they carried in their minds. She did her best to keep up with the conversation, laughing at their jokes and nodding along as they reminisced about their college days. But there was an undercurrent to the evening, a tension she couldn't quite name. It wasn't until the wine began to flow freely that the conversations turned more personal. Someone brought up relationships, sharing a story about an extravagant proposal in Santorini. "What about you, Daniel?" one of the women asked, her red lipstick perfectly intact even after 3 glasses of wine. "When are you going to make an honest woman out of Clara?" Clara's breath caught in her throat, her cheeks flushing as all eyes turned to them. She glanced at Daniel, her heart pounding in anticipation of his response. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made her stomach twist. "Marriage?" he said, shaking his head. "I just don't see myself marrying a black woman." The words landed like a slap, the room falling into a stunned silence. Clara felt the air leave her lungs, her vision narrowing as she stared at him, willing him to take it back. But he didn't. He just sat there, smiling as though he'd said something completely ordinary. "I mean, no offense," he added, glancing at her as if that could soften the blow. "It's just cultural differences, you know. It wouldn't work in the long run." Clara couldn't move, couldn't speak. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the murmured attempts at small talk, as the others tried to steer the conversation away from the wreckage. She didn't know how long she sat there, frozen in place. All she could feel was the crushing weight of his words, the final confirmation of everything she had refused to see. When she finally found the strength to stand, the room seemed to tilt around her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't wait for anyone to respond. Daniel followed her into the hallway, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Clara, what's wrong?" he asked, his tone laced with exasperation. "What's wrong?" she repeated, her voice shaking as she turned to face him. "You just told a room full of people that you could never see a future with me, that I'm not good enough for you because of the color of my skin, and you're asking me what's wrong." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're overreacting. It wasn't personal. I was just being honest." Honest. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Daniel's expression hardened. "I didn't mean to embarrass you, but you can't expect me to ignore the reality of the situation. These things matter, Clara. They always will." Her chest ached with the weight of his words, each one driving a deeper wedge between them. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought we could make this work. That love was enough." He didn't respond, his silence cutting deeper than any argument could have. Clara left the apartment that night, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked aimlessly through the city. The cold air stung her skin, but she barely felt it. All she could think about was the look on Daniel's face, the casual indifference with which he had shattered everything they'd built together. The night air was sharp against Clara's skin as she walked, her heels clicking unevenly on the cracked sidewalk. She had no destination in mind, no plan, just the overwhelming need to get as far away from Daniel as possible. Her chest burned with every breath, her mind replaying his words on an endless loop. "I just don't see myself marrying a black woman." It wasn't the first time he had said something that stung, but this was different. This wasn't a careless comment or a clumsy attempt at humor. This was the truth, stripped bare and laid out for everyone to see. And it was a truth she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Her phone buzzed in her bag, but she didn't bother checking it. She knew it was him, and she couldn't bear to hear his voice. Not after what he had done. Finally, her feet carried her to a small park she used to visit as a child, the kind of place that felt untouched by the chaos of the city. She sank onto a bench, wrapping her arms around herself as the tears came. She cried for the love she had given so freely, for the woman she had been before she met him. She cried for the parts of herself she had silenced, the warnings she had ignored, the friends she had pushed away. And she cried for the fact that deep down she had always known this was how it would end. The days that followed passed in a haze. She avoided Daniel's calls, letting them go to voicemail until he finally gave up. Her apartment felt like a tomb, the silence pressing in on her as she replayed every moment of their relationship. She thought about the first time he had complimented her, the way his words had made her feel beautiful and seen. "You're so beautiful." For a black girl, she had flinched then, but she had brushed it off, desperate to believe that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. She thought about the countless times he had dismissed her concerns, The way he had told her she was overreacting or too sensitive. She had let it slide because love was supposed to be patient, because she thought that if she just loved him enough, he would see her for who she truly was. But now, sitting alone in her apartment, she realized the truth. He had never really seen her at all. It took her 3 days to work up the courage to call Maya. Her hands shook as she dialed the number, her heart pounding in her chest. She half expected it to go straight to voicemail, but after a few rings, Maya picked up. "Clara?" Maya's voice was cautious, as though she wasn't sure whether to be angry or concerned. "Hey," Clara said, her voice cracking. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "For what?" Maya asked finally, her tone unreadable. "For everything," Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "For not listening to you, for pushing you away, for choosing him over you." Maya was quiet for so long that Clara thought she might have hung up. But then she sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "I just didn't want to see you get hurt," she said softly. "I know," Clara whispered, "and you were right. About all of it." They made plans to meet for coffee the next day, and for the first time in days, Clara felt a small flicker of hope. Sitting across from Maya at their favorite cafe, Clara felt the weight of her mistakes settle over her. Maya watched her carefully, her arms crossed over her chest, waiting for her to speak. "He said he could never see himself marrying a black woman," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya's eyes softened, but there was no surprise in her expression. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I should have listened to you," Clara continued, tears welling in her eyes. I thought if I just loved him enough it wouldn't matter, that I could prove I was enough." Maya reached across the table, her hand warm and steady. "It wasn't about you, Clara. It was never about you. He's the one who wasn't enough. He didn't deserve you." Clara nodded, though the words felt hollow. She wanted to believe them, but the wounds were still too fresh. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Clara began to rebuild herself. She threw herself into her work, taking on new projects that challenged and excited her. She reconnected with old friends, filling her evenings with laughter and conversation. But no matter how much she tried to move forward, the scars of her relationship with Daniel lingered. She thought about him more often than she wanted to admit, her mind drifting back to the way he had held her, the way he had made her feel like she was the center of his world. And then she would remember his words, the casual cruelty with which he had dismissed her as a possibility, and the ache in her chest would return. One evening, as she walked home from work, she passed the art gallery where they had first met. She stopped, staring through the glass at the abstract paintings that lined the walls. It felt like a lifetime ago, like she had been a different person back then. She had been so eager to believe in the kind of love that could sweep her off her feet, so desperate to be chosen. Now, as she stood there, she realized that she no longer needed to be chosen. She no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone but herself. Months passed and the seasons began to change. The bitter chill of winter softened into the tentative warmth of spring, and with it came the promise of renewal. Clara had spent those months quietly rebuilding her life piece by piece, reclaiming the parts of herself she had lost. But the process wasn't linear. Healing never was. There were still moments when the weight of what had happened would press down on her, making it hard to breathe. She still thought of Daniel sometimes, his smile, his laugh, the way he had made her feel like she was everything, even as he slowly chipped away at her sense of self. She hadn't heard from him since the night of the dinner party, and she didn't expect to. Whatever they had shared was over, and there was no going back. One afternoon, as she walked through the city, she found herself standing in front of a familiar coffee shop. It was the place where she and Daniel used to meet on lazy Sunday mornings, where they would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air was warm and filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. She ordered her usual drink and found a seat by the window, watching as the world passed by outside. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Maya. "Maya, brunch tomorrow. My treat." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Maya had been her anchor through everything, her constant, even when Clara had pushed her away. Clara wouldn't miss it. She set her phone down and leaned back in her chair, letting the sunlight stream through the window and warm her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, Not the kind that came from forgetting, but the kind that came from acceptance. She had loved Daniel. She had given him her heart, her trust, her vulnerability, and he had broken it, not out of malice, but because he had never truly understood what it meant to love her in return. But she had survived. She had picked herself up from the wreckage and found her way back to the people who truly cared for her. She had learned that her worth wasn't something to be proven or earned. It was something she had always carried within her. That evening, as Clara walked home, she stopped by the park where she had sat on the night of the dinner party. The bench was still there, worn and weathered, but it no longer felt like a place of sorrow. She sat down, letting the cool breeze brush against her skin. She thought about everything she had been through, the love, the heartbreak, the pain, and felt a quiet sense of closure. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced the fire, walked through it, and come out the other side. She was still standing, and that was enough.